Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we take complex topics and, well, make them understandable, useful, and hopefully really fascinating. Today, we're plunging into a world operating just beneath the surface of our global financial system. It's a realm of hidden wealth, obscured ownership. We're talking about something called the shadow economy. Imagine, if you will, a kind of parallel universe, deliberately constructed where trillions, literally trillions of dollars move beyond public scrutiny. For this deep dive, we've gathered some pretty eye-opening research, including a key report, The Shadow Economy, a report on the history, impact, and future of shell companies and offshore havens. Our mission: to understand what this shadow economy actually is, how it was built, who benefits from it, who ends up paying the price, and maybe where it's all heading. We'll explore the sometimes surprisingly mundane tools, but also the sophisticated legal structures that make this system work. And we'll unpack some of the most dramatic revelations that have dragged it, kicking and screaming sometimes, into the light. Get ready, because this is where it gets really interesting.
You might be quite surprised by what we uncover and how deeply it impacts all of us. Okay, let's unpack this then. What exactly are we talking about when we say shadow economy? It sounds a bit cloak and dagger, doesn't it? But it seems to be built on two core concepts, of shell company and the offshore haven.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how simple these basic tools are, yet how powerful they become when you combine them. A shell company, at its core, is really just a corporate entity that mainly exists on paper. Think of it like a legal address, maybe a post office box somewhere sunny, like a Caribbean island. But crucially, it has no significant assets, no real business operations, no employees to speak of. Its main purpose, it's to create a veil of anonymity, to hide the true owner, the beneficial owner, we call them, from tax authorities or law enforcement or even just the public. And these things can be bought off the shelf, activated in less than 24 hours.
Wow. So a phantom corporation, essentially a legal ghost designed purely for concealment. And these ghosts, they need a home, right? Which brings us to the offshore haven.
Exactly. These are often called offshore financial centers, or OFCs. Countries like, say, Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Singapore, or territories like the British Virgin Islands, they've really built their economies by attracting foreign capital. And they do it with a specific set of incentives. Little to no taxation for non-residents, very light touch regulation, and, this is critical, an ironclad commitment to financial secrecy. The term offshore itself is a bit of a historical accident, actually. But what it means now is decoupling the legal location of a transaction from its real economic location. It effectively severs its connection to, well, tax and regulatory liability.
The scale of this parallel universe is just staggering. The report suggests it holds, and this is a conservative estimate, over $12 trillion in private and corporate wealth. Some analyses push that figure as high as $36 trillion. That's equivalent to the combined economies of the US, China, and Japan.
It's enormous.
And it leads to annual tax revenue losses for governments worldwide, estimated between, $500 and $600 billion just from corporations, plus another $200 billion from individuals. That is a huge sum that isn't going to public services.
Yeah, and this raises a really important question. Is the system inherently bad? Proponents argue it plays a legitimate role in the global economy. They say it facilitates cross-border investment, offers asset protection. For individuals, maybe it's about estate planning or just financial privacy. It's often seen as, a necessary lubricant for global capitalism.
But you mentioned a duality earlier. So what's the other side of that coin? What's the darker side?
Well, the very features that provide those perceived advantages, the secrecy, the low taxation, are exactly what make it the primary enabler for illicit activities, too. We're talking industrial-scale tax evasion here, money laundering for organized crime, corruption, concealing wealth looted from developing nations. It creates this kind of two-tiered system of financial justice where the global elite can basically opt out of the obligations that bind ordinary citizens like you and me. And it's crucial to understand this isn't some accidental loophole. It's a deliberate architectural construct. It was built piece by piece over more than a century by lawyers, bankers, accountants, and frankly, complicit governments.
A deliberate construct built over a century. That sounds like quite an origin story. It obviously didn't just appear overnight. So who are these architects? How do they lay the foundations for this $12 trillion secret?
Well, if you connect this to the bigger picture, the modern offshore system, which now routes, believe it or not, nearly half of all international banking assets, didn't start on some remote tropical island. Its foundational principles actually emerged from the United States and Great Britain. The financial centers of the world's most powerful economies.
Okay, so not exactly the exotic locations we often associate with tax havens right away.
Yeah.
What were these foundational principles then?
The report highlights 3 distinct innovations that really became the pillars of the shadow economy. The first pillar was actually an American invention, easy incorporation. Back in the late 19th century, New Jersey, desperate for funds, liberalized its incorporation laws, made it cheap and simple to set up a corporation with minimal oversight. Delaware soon perfected this model around 1898, creating this sort of jurisdictional competition. This was the birth of the shelf company. You could literally just buy one ready-made.
Okay, so that's Pillar 1, easy companies from America. What's next?
Pillar 2 was forged in the British Empire, virtual residency. There was a landmark legal case in 1929, Egyptian Delta Land and Investment Co. Ltd v. Todd. It established that a company could be legally incorporated in the UK, but not subject to British taxation if its central management and control were located elsewhere. This created the non-resident company. And in effect, it made Britain itself a kind of tax haven and extended this principle to its empire, places like Bermuda, the Bahamas, and, crucially, the Cayman Islands.
Right, and the third pillar.
The third pillar, maybe the most infamous, came from Switzerland, codified secrecy. Now, disfranchisement was always a Swiss banking tradition, but the Swiss Banking Act of 1934 changed everything. It transformed secrecy into federal criminal law. Article 47 made it a crime for bank employees to disclose client information. This was partly a response to the global depression and the rise of Nazi Germany, which was trying to seize assets, particularly from Jewish citizens. Switzerland became this inviolable legal sanctuary for capital, and they marketed it aggressively to wealthy Europeans facing rising taxes.
So America's easy companies, Britain's tax-free non-residents, and Switzerland's criminalized secrecy. That is quite the cocktail. But how did this evolve from a few core principles into a truly global system?
The real catalyst was the emergence of the euro market in London during the 1950s. In 1957, the Bank of England made a crucial ruling. It said that transactions conducted in London by UK banks, but for non-UK clients, wouldn't be subject to British regulations. This created this huge, unregulated pool of US dollars held offshore from any national authority. Major banks saw a massive opportunity here, obviously, and they expanded their euro market activities into these fiscally autonomous British territories, like the Channel Islands and, of course, the Caribbean.
And that's where the Cayman Islands really exploded onto the scene, wasn't it?
Precisely. The Caymans, which apparently had almost no lawyers in 1960, started attracting top graduates from Oxford and Cambridge by the early 1970s. These bright legal minds helped draft laws ensuring zero taxation, strict bank secrecy, and modern trust legislation. They basically turned the islands into one of the world's largest financial centers. And look, this was no accident. It was a deliberate economic strategy actively built and sustained by London and New York. The capital, the talent, the legal concepts, they all flowed from these onshore hubs to their new offshore satellites. This Anglo-American model proved so incredibly successful that it just proliferated globally throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Places like Luxembourg, Ireland, Dubai, Vanuatu, they all started copying the legislative playbook. By the early 1990s, the shadow economy wasn't some niche thing anymore. It was absolutely central to global finance.
Right. So for decades, this complex system operated largely, well, in the shadows, as the name suggests. But then the internet arrived. And with it came the era of data leaks. And these were just small trickles. They were like tsunamis of information that completely changed how we understand this secret world.
Yeah, what's really fascinating here is how these leaks transform this sort of abstract concept of offshore into a very tangible reality, a reality of corruption, tax evasion, and just systemic inequality. Whistleblowers, hackers, they pierced that veil of secrecy. They provided journalists with these incredibly detailed, granular views of how the system really worked.
Okay, let's start with the big one. The one that probably introduced most people, including me, to the term shell company, the Panama Papers.
The Panama Papers. April 2016, they were truly explosive. An anonymous source, John Doe, provided 11.5 million confidential documents. That's a massive 2.6 terabytes of data, all from just one law firm, Mossack Fonseca in Panama. These files, they span from the 1970s right up to 2016. They detailed the offshore holdings of 12 current or former world leaders, 143 other politicians.
And the names involved were just shocking. We saw this $2 billion trail linked to associates of Russian President Vladimir Putin, including his childhood friend, the cellist Sergei Rolgin, of all people. Pakistan's then Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, was linked to offshore companies owning luxury London apartments. And who could forget Iceland's Prime Minister, Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson. He was forced to resign after it came out he had an undeclared interest in an offshore company holding bonds in failed Icelandic banks. I mean, talk about a conflict of interest.
Exactly. And beyond the political elite, the Panama Papers revealed the system's role in crime and dodging sanctions. Mossack Fonseca provided services to clients blacklisted by the U.S. Treasury. We're talking front companies for North Korea's nuclear weapons program, firms supplying fuel to Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. They even helped launder proceeds from Britain's notorious 1983 Brinks-Mat gold bullion robbery. There was this internal memo from the firm's partners that just laid it bare. It said something like, 95% of our work coincidentally consists in selling vehicles to avoid taxes. Coincidentally.
Unbelievable. Then, just over a year later, in 2017, came the Paradise Papers. This leak seemed to shift the focus a bit, didn't it? Away from maybe outright illegal stuff to something perhaps equally infuriating.
Indeed. The Paradise Papers' 13.4 million documents, this time mainly from Appleby, a very prestigious Bermuda-based law firm, and some others, they really shone a light on the often legal but incredibly sophisticated tax avoidance strategies, the kind used by the world's largest corporations and wealthiest individuals. Appleby was part of what they call the Offshore Magic Circle, serving blue-chip clients.
Like Nike, right. Using a Bermudian subsidiary to hold its famous swoosh trademark. This meant its European headquarters could pay these huge royalties to tax-free Bermuda, effectively wiping out taxable profits in higher-tax European countries. And Apple. After facing scrutiny over his Irish setup, it secretly searched for a new tax haven, eventually settling on Jersey, which has a 0% corporate tax rate, sheltering billions. Even Queen Elizabeth II's private estate was found to have invested millions in offshore funds.
Yeah, this leak didn't just expose a few bad apples, it really highlighted a systemic feature of the global economy. And it fueled enormous public outrage over the unfairness, the feeling that ordinary citizens pay their taxes while the powerful just play by completely different rules. This directly led to the EU creating its first ever blacklist of non-cooperative tax havens.
Okay, and finally, the biggest leak yet, in 2021. The Pandora Papers. What made this one so groundbreaking? It felt like another level again.
The Pandora Papers were just the most expansive leak to date. We're talking 11.9 million files, but this time from 14 different offshore service providers all around the globe. So it showed the breadth of the industry. It implicated 35 current and former world leaders, over 330 other public officials, nearly 3 times the number exposed in all the previous major leaks combined. We saw King Abdullah II of Jordan with a secret $100 million property empire. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, who'd campaigned on anti-corruption, secretly owning a network of offshore companies.
But the biggest revelation, the one that really made me sit up and take notice, was the exposure of the United States itself as a major global tax haven. The country that had kind of pioneered the crackdown on offshore evasion was suddenly revealed to be a magnet for hidden wealth.
This is such a critical point. While the U.S. had been arguably a leader in pushing for financial transparency elsewhere, the Pandora Papers revealed profound hypocrisy. Hundreds of millions of dollars were shown moving from traditional havens into newly created trusts in U.S. states like South Dakota, Florida, Delaware, Texas, Nevada. These states offer extreme secrecy and asset protection, often with no income tax, no inheritance tax, no capital gains taxes on trust assets. They were actively marketing themselves as rivals to places like Switzerland or the Caymans.
Wow. So the progression we see from Panama to Paradise to Pandora shows us a system that's constantly evolving, constantly adapting. It moves from maybe more clearly illegal activities to technically legal avoidance, and then even to onshoring secrecy within powerful nations themselves. The industry isn't just about hiding anymore, is it? It's about making ownership legally indecipherable. It's moved from secrecy to obscurity. Okay, these numbers, these names, the scale, it's all staggering, but let's bring it down to earth. What does this all mean for you and me? What are the real-world consequences beyond the balance sheets of huge corporations and the private accounts of the super wealthy?
Yeah, this is an important question because the impact really does extend far beyond finance. It's deeply social and political. The vast sums of money diverted into this shadow economy represent a direct drain on public treasuries, and that leads to profound, genuinely damaging effects on societies all around the world.
So it's definitely not just some abstract financial concept. It actually impacts our daily lives.
Absolutely. The most quantifiable damage is that staggering loss of tax revenue we talked about earlier. Estimates consistently put the annual global loss from corporate and individual tax abuse in the hundreds of billions of dollars. For developing nations, the consequences are particularly devastating. We're talking around $200 billion lost annually. That sum exceeds the total amount they receive in foreign development assistance each year. Just think about that.
Wow. So money that could be building hospitals, schools, clean water systems, basic infrastructure is just disappearing offshore instead. And that last revenue, that burden, must fall somewhere else, right?
Yeah, it absolutely does. When multinational corporations shift their profits to avoid taxes, and when wealthy individuals hide their assets offshore, the fiscal burden inevitably shifts onto those with less power and less mobility. That means small businesses, that means middle and working class families who typically pay their taxes through payroll deductions, through consumption taxes like VAT. This underfunding of public services forces governments into difficult choices. Cut essential services, increase borrowing, which burdens future generations, or raise taxes on the majority, all while vast amounts of wealth remain untaxed offshore.
And the report also mentions something called the finance curse. This applies to some of the jurisdictions that actually host these offshore centers. What's that about? It sounds a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because you'd think these places would be booming. But even for the jurisdictions hosting these centers, the benefits are often illusory. They tend to be concentrated among a very small elite: the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers serving the offshore clients. An oversized, secretive financial sector can lead to what economists call a brain drain. It pulls talented individuals away from more productive sectors of the economy, like manufacturing or education or healthcare, into these high-paying but often socially unproductive financial roles. It can also massively inflate local prices, especially real estate, making life completely unaffordable for ordinary residents. And it increases the whole economy's vulnerability to global financial shocks and crises. It can actually become a kind of lose-lose proposition, harming the global community while distorting their own local economies.
This whole system sounds like it also drives a huge wedge in society. It creates a massive social fracture.
It absolutely functions as a powerful engine of economic inequality. Research consistently shows that something like 80% of all offshore wealth belongs to the top 0.1% of households globally. And for the super, super rich, the top 0.01%, maybe as much as 30% to 40% of their total wealth is held abroad, offshore. What this means is that global inequality is likely far, far greater than the official statistics suggest, because those statistics often miss this huge chunk of hidden wealth. The offshore system actively creates and accelerates inequality.
So essentially, it allows the global elite to opt out of the social contract, that implicit agreement that everyone contributes their fair share to society.
Precisely. They benefit from stable legal systems, educated workforces, public infrastructure, all the things taxes pay for, but they use offshore secrecy to avoid contributing their share to maintain them. This creates a two-tiered system of citizenship and justice. One set of rules for the super rich, another for everyone else. And the public perception of this fundamental unfairness deeply erodes trust. Trust in government, trust in the tax system, trust in the rule of law itself. It fuels cynicism, political polarization, especially when you see leaders preaching austerity while being revealed, through leaks, to be using these very structures themselves. In developing countries, it can even lead to political instability as corrupt elites loot national resources, hide them offshore, and deprive their own nations of the capital needed for recovery and development.
Okay, the picture you've painted is pretty stark. It sounds like a system designed to be impenetrable, maybe leaving many people feeling helpless. But surely someone's tried to fight back. After the 2008 financial crisis, after these massive leaks, did governments finally say enough is enough and take serious action?
They did. The global financial crisis was a major turning point. Governments were suddenly under severe budgetary strain, desperate for revenue. This fundamentally shifted the political tolerance for large-scale tax evasion. That, combined with the massive public outrage generated by the leaks we discussed, created real momentum. It led to the most significant global transparency initiatives in probably a century, specifically targeting the bedrock of the offshore world: banking secrecy.
Right, this is where it gets really interesting. What was the first major blow struck against that secrecy?
The first and arguably the most powerful blow came from the United States. It was the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, better known as FESIA, enacted back in 2010. It was revolutionary, really, in its simplicity and its brute force. Instead of trying to negotiate with individual countries to pierce their secrecy laws one by one, FESIA basically targeted the entire global financial system itself.
How did it actually work? What was the mechanism?
FTC essentially requires all foreign financial institutions, banks, brokerages, investment funds, you name it, to report information about accounts held by U.S. taxpayers directly to the IRS, the U.S. tax authority. And the enforcement mechanism was formidable. Any institution that didn't comply would face a punitive 30% withholding tax on all its U.S. source payments. That effectively meant being cut off from the largest financial system in the world, a death sentence for most banks.
Wow, that's a serious threat. So what was the response? Did they just roll over?
The global banking industry basically capitulated. Nations, even historic bastions of secrecy like Switzerland, had little choice. They signed these things called intergovernmental agreements, IGAs, with the U.S. to facilitate this automatic information exchange. FATCA single-handedly shattered the concept of absolute banking secrecy and established a completely new global norm.
And that American blueprint then went global, is that right?
Exactly. FSOC provided the model for the Common Reporting Standard, or CRS. This was developed by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, with backing from the G20 major economies in 2014. CRS is essentially a multilateral, reciprocal version of FATCA. Now, over 100 jurisdictions automatically exchange financial account information with each other every year based on tax residency. Financial institutions report account holder info to their local tax authority, which then automatically transmits it to the account holder's home country's tax authority.
So between FASA forcing the issue and CRS making it global and reciprocal, does that sound like the end of the secret offshore bank account? Problem solved? Or is there still a kind of cat and mouse game going on?
Well, the impact has definitely been profound, no question. It's dramatically increased the risk and the difficulty of hiding money in undeclared foreign bank accounts. The OECD itself reports things like a 20-25% reduction in bank deposits held in traditional international financial centers. And tens of billions of dollars in previously undeclared taxes have been recouped by governments worldwide. The era of the reliable secret Swiss bank account is effectively over, but... and it's a big but. The offshore industry has proven remarkably resilient and adaptable, and the most significant, most glaring loophole right now is the United States itself. As we touched on with the Panama Papers, while the U.S. pioneered FITICA to get information from other countries, it has refused to fully adopt the reciprocal CRS model. So the U.S. demands vast amounts of data from the rest of the world about its citizens abroad, but it provides significantly less information in return about foreigners holding assets in the U.S. This asymmetry has, ironically, transformed the United States into one of the most attractive destinations for foreigners seeking to hide wealth from their own governments. The country that forced open Swiss bank accounts has become, in essence, the new Switzerland for many others.
That is quite the irony. A stunning twist, really. So if hiding money in traditional bank accounts is harder, where else is the industry shifting its focus? What are the new methods?
Well, the reforms primarily targeted those undeclared bank accounts. So the industry has shifted partly towards non-financial assets, things like luxury real estate in major cities, fine art, private jets, super yachts, assets that are harder to track and value, and often fall outside financial reporting rules. But more importantly, the real shift is towards using complex legal structures. We're talking opaque trusts, foundations, multi-layered corporate ownership chains that snake across several different jurisdictions. These structures are deliberately designed to break the chain of beneficial ownership, to make it nearly impossible for authorities or anyone else to determine who ultimately owns and controls an asset.
Ah, so it's not about hiding the existence of the asset anymore, like a secret bank account, but about completely obscuring its ownership, making it legally invisible in a way.
Exactly. The product, the service being sold, has evolved from secrecy, just hiding the information, to obscurity, making the information so complex and fragmented that it's effectively meaningless. And crucially, the enablers, the lawyers, the accountants, the corporate service providers who design these incredibly complex, often technically legal schemes, they frequently face much less scrutiny than the banks and financial institutions themselves.
Right. So the fight for transparency has definitely reshaped the landscape, but it clearly hasn't eliminated the shadow economy or even really diminished its overall scale. It's just adapted. So what does the offshore world look like today? And what's potentially on the horizon?
Yeah, what's really fascinating here is that the traditional image we might have of a tax haven, Switzerland and maybe a few sunny Caribbean islands, that's really outdated now. While those places certainly remain significant players, the contemporary map of the offshore world is far more diverse. We've seen new guards rise to prominence.
Who are these new players? Where is the money flowing now?
Well, Singapore and Hong Kong have become premier hubs in Asia. They offer political stability, sophisticated financial infrastructure, and access to the huge Asian market. The UAE, particularly Dubai, has become a major magnet for international wealth, attracting flows from Europe, Asia, and Africa, often with very few questions asked. And critically, some of the world's largest onshore economies, like the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, even the United Kingdom itself, through its crown dependencies and overseas territories, function as vital conduit OFCs. They act as intermediaries, using their extensive networks of tax treaties to legally route corporate profits from high-tax countries towards zero-tax havens elsewhere. They're crucial nodes in the network. And as we've discussed, the U.S. itself has emerged as a leading secrecy jurisdiction through those state-level trust laws in places like South Dakota and Delaware, attracting foreign wealth seeking anonymity.
So it's not just small islands anymore. It's major global financial players deeply embedded in facilitating this system. And the methods of concealment have evolved beyond just a simple shell company, too.
Oh, absolutely. Forget a single shell company in Panama. State-of-the-art techniques now involve these multi-pronged approaches. You have complex trust and foundation structures layered across multiple jurisdictions, often combining common law trusts with civil law foundations. You have anonymous ownership instruments like bearer shares, where they're still permitted. And as we mentioned, storing wealth in high-value, portable, and often unregulated or underregulated assets. Fine art free ports, precious metals, luxury real estate held through anonymous LLCs, and perhaps most significantly now, cryptocurrencies.
Ah, crypto. That feels like the ultimate frontier for anonymity, perhaps. How does that change the game for regulators trying to keep up?
This really raises the most important question for the future, I think. Cryptocurrencies offer features that are inherently attractive to anyone seeking to move and store value outside the traditional regulated financial system. Transactions on a decentralized blockchain happen peer-to-peer. They don't necessarily need a bank or a financial intermediary that's subject to FASIA or CRS reporting rules. This creates the potential, at least, for a parallel financial system operating largely beyond conventional tax and anti-money laundering regulations.
And you're saying offshore jurisdictions are actively embracing this, trying to become crypto hubs.
Absolutely. Jurisdictions from the British Virgin Islands to Switzerland, Singapore, Dubai, El Salvador, they're actively competing to become crypto-friendly hubs. They're developing light-touch regulatory frameworks specifically designed to attract cryptocurrency exchanges, digital asset funds, and wealthy crypto investors. It's really a new phase in that global race to the bottom, competing not just on low taxes and secrecy anymore, but on permissive regulations for this burgeoning trillion-dollar digital asset class.
But I imagine regulators like the OECD and governments aren't just sitting idly by watching this happen. They must be trying to catch up.
No, they're definitely not sitting still. The OECD is already working hard on something called its Crypto Asset Reporting Framework, or CARF. The goal is to create a CRS-like system for the automatic exchange of information specifically about crypto assets held through intermediaries like exchanges. However, the technological challenges are immense, especially with the rise of decentralized finance or DeFi platforms. These are designed by their very nature to operate without central intermediaries, making traditional regulatory oversight extremely difficult, if not impossible in some cases. So this really sets the stage for a new, very complex regulatory chase, a high-stakes game between innovation seeking anonymity and regulation, trying to maintain transparency and control. Yet, there is a potential flip side. The inherent transparency of public blockchains, the fact that they record every single transaction pseudonymously, could also be a powerful tool for forensic accountants and law enforcement, allowing them to trace illicit funds in ways that weren't possible before if they have the right tools and expertise.
Right. So this deep dive has really shown us that the history of the offshore world, the shadow economy, it's a story of this perpetual conflict, this back and forth between secrecy and transparency. The leaks of the past decades certainly dragged this hidden world blinking into the public spotlight. They created the political momentum for genuine change for new transparency measures. Regulations like FTC and CRS have dismantled the old model of absolute banking secrecy. They've made the world a much smaller, much riskier place for old-fashioned tax evaders hiding money in simple bank accounts.
That's true. But if we connect this back to the bigger picture, it's also crystal clear that the offshore system, the shadow economy, is remarkably resilient. It's incredibly adaptive. The war on tax havens isn't really a conflict that can be definitively won and then we can all go home. It seems to be a permanent feature of a globalized economy where capital is fluid, moving at the speed of light, while national laws remain largely fixed within borders. As long as there's powerful demand from individuals, from corporations, for secrecy, for asset protection, for tax minimization, well, an industry will inevitably emerge to supply it.
So the future is likely to be more complex, maybe a bifurcation.
Yeah.
One path heading towards hopefully greater transparency in the traditional financial system, thanks to things like CRS. But maybe another parallel digital offshore world leveraging cryptocurrencies and complex structures for potentially even higher levels of anonymity and obscurity.
That seems plausible, and this raises, I think, an important question for you, our listener. Given the sheer scale of wealth hidden offshore, the vast tax revenues lost, and the profound global inequality of fuels, how much responsibility do we ultimately place on individuals seeking these services? How much on the professional enablers, the lawyers, the accountants, the banks? And how much responsibility lies with the governments themselves, particularly those within powerful nations that have, perhaps inadvertently or perhaps deliberately, allowed themselves to become secrecy havens, undermining global efforts? What kind of global cooperation, what kind of political will is truly needed to address this fundamental challenge to the social contract, to basic fairness?
That is an important thought to leave with. This fight for tax fairness, for the fiscal health of nations, and ultimately for the integrity of our economic systems, it clearly requires constant vigilance, constant adaptation. It's about trying to ensure that the rules of the global economy apply fairly to everyone, not just to those who lack the means or the inclination to buy their way out of them. We certainly hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of this complex, often hidden world. And perhaps it's even given you a few more questions to explore on your own. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.